This video was selected by our backers on Patreon. Choose our video topics, get a load more perks, and support the channel by clicking the link below. So why is Taiwan in the news at the moment? Well, it's largely because, in recent days, China has started flying a record number of planes into Taiwan's Air Defense Identification Zone, or ADIZ. An ADIZ is basically an airspace surveilled by a country in the interests of national security. Now, it's worth noting that Taiwan's ADIZ is not the same as Taiwanese airspace. ADIZs aren't recognised by international treaties, and are basically just unilateral assertions by governments that if you enter this space, you should check with us first. National airspaces, on the other hand, are recognised by international treaties like the 1944 Chicago Convention, and basically give nation-states control over the sky above their land and territorial sea. According to the UN Convention on the Law of the Sea, a nation's territorial sea extends 12 nautical miles from its coast, which means that Taiwanese airspace is basically the land above Taiwan plus 12 miles in any direction. Taiwan's ADIZ, on the other hand, is a fair bit bigger, and even includes parts of mainland China. Taiwan's ADIZ was defined by the US military after World War II, when the US recognised the Kuomintang, who had de facto jurisdiction over Taiwan as the legitimate government of China. Anyway, as I said, the reason that Taiwan's in the news at the moment is because China's been flying more and more planes into its ADIZ without asking Taiwan's permission, known as incursions. As we explained in our video on the topic in January, Taiwan's ADIZ includes part of mainland China, where, obviously, you'd expect to find Chinese aircraft. However, in practice, when we're talking about planes in their ADIZ, it's only counted as an incursion if the Chinese aircraft cross the Taiwan Strait Meridian Line, which runs down the middle of the Taiwanese Strait. Now, in 1979, when the US formally cut diplomatic ties with Taiwan until March 2019, China basically stayed out of Taiwan's ADIZ. However, over the last 2.5 years, China has started regular incursions, which have reached a peak over the last few days. During China's National Day on Friday the 1st of October, China sent 39 planes into Taiwan's ADIZ, a record at the time. Then, on Saturday, they sent 39 planes, before setting the record again on Monday with 56, including 34 J-16 fighter jets and 12 H-6 bombers. Unsurprisingly, this increased velocity from China has made Taiwan anxious. Taiwan's defense minister claimed that Taiwan-China relations were at a 40-year low, and suggested that China would be ready to invade Taiwan as soon as 2025. This would obviously be terrible for Taiwan, but it could possibly spiral into a global war if the US intervened to help Taiwan. The US's position on Taiwan is defined as strategic ambiguity. Essentially, the language in the Taiwan Relations Act of 1979 leaves it ambiguous as to whether the US would actually intervene in the case of a Taiwan-China war. For most of the last 40 years, strategic ambiguity was a good strategy. It discouraged China from invading Taiwan in case the US retaliated against them, and while also discouraging Taiwan from formally declaring independence, which would almost definitely lead to a conflict with China, because they couldn't be sure that the US would definitely have their back. However, today the US's policy of strategic ambiguity doesn't seem to be doing much to deter China. And it means that, if China does eventually invade Taiwan, there's a real possibility that the US will intervene, sparking a third world war. And if you weren't feeling anxious enough, there are reasons to expect that a US-China war over Taiwan is only going to get more likely. There are basically 3 trends that make a Chinese invasion of Taiwan more likely. Increased Chinese military might, increasing anti-China sentiment within Taiwan, and worsening China-US relations. Let's start with China's military. Taiwan is a mountainous island, and invading it would require a massive amphibious military exercise that, by some estimates, would require as many as 1 million soldiers. Historically, that's been enough to put China off. But as China spends more and more on its military, vastly outspending Taiwan, invasion has become increasingly viable. Now, it's worth noting that Taiwan has recently committed to upping its defense spending significantly over the next 5 years, from 1.9% of GDP to just over 3%. But nonetheless, it's probably too little too late, and is unlikely to do much to discourage China. The point is that as China's military spending continues to increase, war with Taiwan looks ever more likely. Secondly, Taiwan is becoming increasingly anti-China. Historically, China had hoped to achieve reunification with Taiwan through peaceful means, but now that's looking increasingly unlikely. And that's in part because the Taiwanese public are at the moment less likely to identify as Chinese than ever before. Back in 1992, 46% of people living in Taiwan identified as Chinese, while just 18% identified as Taiwanese. Today, though, 68% identify as Taiwanese, while just 2% identify as Chinese. They're also definitely less keen on mainland China and the prospect of reunification. In the 2020 presidential election, the Democratic Progressive Party, who are basically the more anti-China party in Taiwan, won with a landslide 57% of the vote, the highest vote share won by the DPP in a presidential election. The Kuomintang, who are more pro-China, won just 39% of the vote. This is presumably partly because as China becomes more authoritarian under Xi Jinping, its political and cultural gap with Taiwan, a relatively liberal country, grows wider and wider. Anyway, the point is that Taiwan is growing more and more wary of China, which makes the possibility of peaceful reunification less and less likely. The third issue is China's worsening relations with the US. In case you somehow haven't noticed over the last few years, China-US relations have got steadily worse. They went really downhill under Trump, but Biden has continued much of Trump's anti-China rhetoric and policy. The US public is also warier than ever about China. In 2020, just 22% of Americans had a favourable view of China, compared to 73% who had a negative view. It's worth noting that this isn't a US-specific trend either. As you can probably see from this graph, basically every developed country in the world thinks worse of China than they did in the 2000s, and by some remarkable margins. In 2002, everyone apart from Italy had a net favourable opinion on China, with an average approval rating of positive 17%. By 2020, none of the surveyed countries had a net favourable opinion, and the average had fallen to negative 51%. This has two implications for Taiwan. Firstly, it means that China are going to be more likely to ignore US warnings about Taiwan. And secondly, it means that US retaliation is more likely. You get the point though. Confrontation between Taiwan and China is becoming ever more likely. As a final thing, it's worth noting that even if no one actually wants war, it could happen accidentally. All it takes is one downed Chinese or Taiwanese jet to spark World War III, and the more incursions that China sends into Taiwanese airspace, the more likely this becomes. This is what Antony Blinken was talking about when he warned China that this practice of regular incursions risks miscalculation. Even though war is probably still unlikely, it's genuinely terrible that the risk of World War III is as high as it is, and de-escalation is morally necessary at this point. We always talk about war in the abstract, as a hypothetical could X and Y happen, but it's important to remember how utterly catastrophic a war between China and the US would be, and everyone should do what they can to minimize the chances of that happening. Anyway, that's the long and short of it. China is becoming increasingly aggressive towards Taiwan, and things only look like they're getting worse. But what do you think? Are we overestimating the risks here, or is it time to hide in our bunkers? Comment your thoughts down below. As I said at the start, our backers on Patreon chose this video, so hopefully you enjoyed it. If you want your say next time, then head over to Patreon and sign up now. In return, you'll get a whole bunch of perks, like early access to videos, exclusive live streams, behind the scenes posts, and special discounts. The link is down below, and we couldn't do any of this without your support. Thanks so much. Also, be sure to subscribe to the channel and hit the bell icon to be notified every time we release a new video. Special thanks to our Patreon backers who make videos like this one possible. And if you want to see your name at the end of videos, then you too can back us on Patreon. The link to that is in the description.